Good afternoon, everybody. I am standing in beautiful downtown Charleston on the corner of Broad Street and Meeting Street. Most of you that have lived in Charleston know this is affectionately called the Four Corners of Law because there's representation of City Hall. The Charleston City Hall is right behind me here, and there's the county government, and then the federal courthouse, and then this beautiful church that I'll show you in the background. And today I'm reminded of the influence of all these laws on us as Americans, and certainly the government has an influence on us, but I would submit to you that God's law would trump all these laws. And God's law is represented by this beautiful church behind me. And today, I'd like to tell you about Charleston and the colonial days when the sailors would come in, sail into Charleston. They called this the Holy City. And it was called the Holy City because they could see from miles out in the ocean. They could see the top of the steeples of all the churches that were in Charleston. So that's how Charleston got the name of the Holy City, and it's kind of been maintained that way ever since. So what I'm trying to do today is to talk about how these laws have influenced us as human beings and as Americans. And specifically, I'd like to talk about the recent abortion law in the states of Vermont, Virginia, and New York, which have basically included infanticide in the abortion laws. And I'm here to submit to you today that all these different laws have an influence on our culture, but we've gotten away from the influence of God's law, represented by this church that's behind me. We've just gotten away from, as Americans, we've gone down a path that I think has led us into a lot of treacherous waters. And I think God will judge us based on how that law affects our country and how we look at the whole issue. So I'm appealing to you today as Christians to remember that God's law is superior to all the laws that are represented here on this corner in Charleston, South Carolina. And that I believe that we as Christians ought to oppose these laws that are being propagated and legislated in our country today, that basically allows children that are born outside the womb to be killed because the parents decided they didn't want to have the baby. And so I think there's something morally wrong with that. You may disagree, and that's your prerogative to do that, but I believe as Christians we're going to be judged on what side of God's law we stand on. I certainly don't profess to be any saint by any stretch of the imagination, but I do believe that we ought to take a stand on this issue, the issue of free abortion and infanticide, the way it's being played out in our country. I think we need to take action. I think we need to, as Christian Americans, we need to take action and oppose this, and that's why I'm here today. I want to voice my opposition to the way our laws have been played out on the abortion issue. And the question that I have is for Christians that call themselves Democrats, how they can support legislation of this nature in these states where they allowed the infanticide legislation to be passed. I think Christians will be held accountable for not standing on the right side of God's law. Now, you may call me a hater or call me all kinds of names that they tend to use for our president, but I'll take it because I believe the Bible says that if we're on the right side of God's law, we're going to be persecuted. So as a human being and as a citizen of this country and as a Christian, I make a stand today that I oppose the infanticide abortion legislation that is catching on in this country. I oppose abortion in any form. I think the Bible speaks very clearly on the sanctity of life, and I think we ought to preserve that. So that's my opinion for what it's worth, and I'm sure I'll get tons of hate mail and all that, but bring it on. Thank you. Oh, one other thing. I want to tell you today that Ben Sasse, the senator from Nebraska, is actually addressing this issue in the Senate. And he's talking about a legislation that would maybe put a cap on this rampant infanticide legislation that's catching on in at least 3 states. So if you're a Christian, I would ask that you pray for our Senate and our common sense lawmakers that they would make the right decision in regards to that legislation to help us turn back the tide which is leading our country into apostasy, which is basically the denial of anything related to God and His laws. I think it's a critical time in the life of America that we need to stand in opposition to things that are contrary to God's law. Anyway, for what it's worth, I'm Phil Norris. Thank you.